everyone. I'm Patrice Lallam, and I work with the Carbon Management Program at the Great Plains Institute. We appreciate you joining us for this webinar. As a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, GPI works with diverse interests to transform the energy system to benefit the economy and the environment. We combine our unique consensus building approach, expert knowledge, research and analysis, and local action to work on solutions that strengthen communities and provide greater economic opportunity through the creation of higher paying jobs, expansion of the nation's industrial base, and greater domestic energy independence while eliminating carbon emissions. Our carbon management team is focused on expanding and accelerating economy-wide commercial deployment of the entire suite of carbon management and industrial solutions by 2030, so that projects and infrastructure can then be scaled to meet mid-century climate goals. We facilitate several efforts relating to carbon management, including the Carbon Capture Coalition, the Regional Carbon Capture Deployment Initiative, and the Industrial Innovation Initiative. And we are now working to ramp up our work with our stakeholders relating to implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed late last year. Today's educational webinar is focused on DOE's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which was established through the Infrastructure Act. And over the next 5 years, this new office is expected to select and manage many large-scale demonstration and pilot projects, and will be administering more than $20 billion, including $3.5 billion for carbon capture, $500 million for industrial emissions, and $8 billion for clean hydrogen demonstrations. And so today we are pleased to welcome two experts from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, or ITIF. David Hart is the director for the Center for Clean Energy Innovation, which seeks to accelerate the transition of the domestic and global energy systems to low carbon resources. Prior to joining ITIF, David published numerous articles on energy innovation policy. And in addition, in 2011 and 2012, David served as Assistant Director for Innovation Policy at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And joining David today is his colleague, Jetta Wong, who serves as a senior fellow to the Center for Clean Energy Innovation. And in addition to her role at ITIF, Jetta is the president of JLW Advising, where she advises clients on how to bring new clean energy technologies to the market. Previously, she worked at the Department of Energy, joining the DOE in July of 2012. And before her work at DOE, she worked for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. David and Jetta coordinate a multi-stakeholder group that has developed recommendations to DOE on the newly established Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. After their presentation, my colleague Jesse Stolark will join us to help manage and moderate a discussion about how this new office at DOE can effectively manage carbon and hydrogen demonstration dollars. For our webinar participants, the Q&A function is open to you throughout the webinar to start posting questions. We will be moderating and reviewing those questions and helping to moderate the discussion after our presentation. So with that, please welcome David Hart and Jetta Wong.
Thank you, Patrice. I think Grace has some slides that she is going to run. And let me say how excited I am to see this new office come to pass, and to see the excitement in the community as reflected in the attendance in today's webinar. If you want to follow our work, you can find us on Twitter at these handles. Go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to provide a bit of background on the concept, and then Jetta will take us through the most recent developments, and I think lead into your questions about how the office is going to operate, which I have to admit we don't really know all the answers to yet, because it's just getting started, and there's an opportunity for stakeholders to shape it. And so it's great that you're all engaged with this topic. So I'm an academic by background. I teach at George Mason University, and I've been concerned about demonstration projects for quite some time. And when I started work at ITIF several years ago, it was one of the first areas that I focused on. So I published a report in 2017 on the Obama era demonstration projects that were federally funded. And then in 2020, this report that you see on your screen, which advocated for something like what became the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and then more recently have written about industrial demonstration projects. So there's a body of detailed work if you want to get into kind of the concepts behind it. Next slide, please. So the main reason for being concerned about demonstration is that the US isn't really very good at commercializing new energy technologies. This is a very generic slide. We have another, Jetta and I have another project we've been working on, which is to create a foundation that would work with DOE called, now called the Foundation for Energy Security and Innovation, which we actually think will get established sometime this year. It's a little bit behind OCED in the policy development cycle. But this concept, I think, is familiar to most people who have thought about innovation. The public sector in the United States especially does a great job of funding basic research, so folks like me at universities. We also have a very vibrant private sector, but in between, who carries new technologies through the expensive stages of getting them turned into prototypes and turned into working models and turned into actual things that can make people enough money for investors to want to put their own dollars into. So this valley of death is a very broad idea, and one of our main agendas is to fill it in a variety of different ways, which the demonstration office is a big part of that. Next slide, please. So this slide is another representation of the same thing, but focusing specifically on one so-called valley of death, which is that last step before projects are commercially viable. And the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations is meant to fill this gap. These are very large projects of the sort that many of you are working on. They're expensive. There's some risk involved in them, of various types of risk, and we can talk about the different kinds of risks. And they also don't necessarily the reward, especially the risk takers. So if you prove something can be done, then your imitators or competitors can also do it, and often they benefit from the fact that you've shown that it can be done. So as a result, the private sector tends to view these projects with some skepticism, doesn't want to put its own money in. And in large-scale research on this topic, it's been shown that almost 2/3 or more of all the demonstration projects that get done have to have some form of public funding. And this is a global issue. It's not confined to the US. So what we need is a system that can share the costs, share the risks between the public and private sectors. So that's what our report lays out, that kind of rationale for a public role. And then next slide, please. So we also mentioned a bunch of areas where we think this problem applies, areas where it's difficult to get private funding, but there are opportunities that are on the doorstep of commercialization or getting close to that. And we would like to have a structure that can fund these, manage the risk, and hopefully hand it off to the private sector to do follow-on projects that will succeed on their own. Next slide. So then the question is, so our recommendation is to increase the investment. We said $5 billion per year. And in fact, somewhat to my surprise, this is the level, maybe not exactly that level, but this is the scale of money that's coming through the Infrastructure Act. It's for the demo office, it's $20 billion over 5 years. And then there are also some demonstration funds that are allocated to specific offices in DOE. So this recommendation actually was close to being realized, at least for the next few years with the infrastructure bill. Next slide, please. So the second part of the report dealt with how should the government manage it. And I won't go through all of this in any detail, but we looked at 5 different ways that it might be managed. The traditional way that these kind of large projects are managed is by the DOE's applied energy offices. So during the Recovery Act, there was a fair amount of money that was pushed through those offices into carbon capture, into energy storage, into a number of the areas that were mentioned on the prior slide. There have been a bunch of other ideas put forward for managing demonstration projects, including my own. Number 5 was something I came up with in a book project with a colleague. Number 3 is an idea that the Bipartisan Policy Center is still working on, that's been advanced over the years. So the next slide, please. So what we did in the report is take these 8 criteria for evaluating the 5 types of management structures. So I'll spare you the gory details here, but the core of the report is a little matrix that is 5 on one side and 8 across the top. So there's 40 little boxes that we tried to fill in, thinking through for each of these management structures, how would they fare if you apply these criteria to them? And through that thinking, we came up with this idea, what we called the Office of Major Demonstrations, which is very similar to what was actually enacted. So it's a freestanding office within DOE that would cover a wide range of technologies, and its expertise would be in managing demonstration projects. And our argument is that it's a different kind of expertise than what the Department of Energy typically does. DOE is very good at running R&D projects, but those projects aren't really oriented towards users. They're not really oriented towards the market. And they're not really concerned with thinking about the nuances of finance, especially blending together public and private finance. So we think there needs to be we thought at that time that there needed to be a new entity that could develop this expertise. And we argued that it should be housed within the Department of Energy. So if you can go to the next slide, please. There's a bunch of trade-offs as you think about this. It would be great to have a freestanding entity outside of the Department of Energy with a big slug of funding that it could put towards these projects. But we essentially concluded that it wasn't, and I should excuse Jetta from this. She wasn't a co-author of this report, though she can speak for herself. But my co-author and I concluded that it wouldn't be feasible to put together, say, $60 billion and take it essentially outside of congressional purview and let that new entity decide what projects should get funded. So we weighed the trade-offs, as you see on this slide, that if there was a new office, it could potentially manage a portfolio of demonstration projects across a bunch of different technology areas. It could develop this specialized expertise if it can hire the right people, and that's still a big if. Now OSED is just starting to hire people. It's still subject to congressional influence. There's really no way to avoid that. Essentially, that was my conclusion. These are big projects. Members of Congress are inevitably going to be interested in them. And the idea of completely taking it outside the realm of political influence was not realistic. However, of course, we would like to control that, try to make sure that project selection is made on the basis of technical criteria and project termination is made on the basis of technical criteria. So, and we think this new structure could have some benefits that way, but it's not completely outside of the political realm. This office is going to have to deal with local stakeholders. It's going to have to deal with international stakeholders as well. Whether it can be funded, on a steady and sufficient basis, we'll see. But the Infrastructure Act is a great start. It's several years worth of funding. We're not sure what will happen after that, and we could talk about that. But that's pretty far away at this point. Our working group is just starting to think about that. So we recommended in the report that the DOE be authorized by Congress to set up this office, and now we're hopeful. It's a little scary, as I've been saying to people. I feel a little bit like the dog that caught the car. It's a much bigger office than I ever imagined, and we'll have to see if it operates the way we hoped in our paper. Next slide, please. So this basically just repeats that we recommended it for various reasons. I think with that, I turn it over to Jetta to take us through the timeline. So that's the next slide. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, David. So everyone can tell that David has been working on this demonstrations particular topic for a very long time, which is exciting because, as he said, he's the dog that caught the car, and the car happened to be going really, really fast. So post David's report, what usually takes many years of legislation being introduced and then getting passed and then hopefully getting an appropriation all happen in a little over a year. After David's report was published in 2020, the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee basically introduced a piece of legislation that got passed on the House side, but didn't get quite through the final package on the Senate side in the Energy Act of 2020, but basically gave the Department of Energy the ability to kind of put all those kinds of activities into one office as what we were calling the Office of Major Demonstrations. Fast forward throughout last year, after a paragraph in a budget and a couple pages in a legislative package, all got wrapped up into the infrastructure bill, we have a new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations that took, like I said, a little over a year to get fully authorized with a $21.5 billion budget. This is not something that usually happens. So even if this bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, had not passed, I'd like to also point out that the appropriators would have funded this office. They, on the House side, had 200 million, on the Senate side, had 100 million. So in addition to the money that the office received through the infrastructure package, it will also likely receive, if the Congress is able to finally do its appropriations process, another $100 or $200 million, which again would have been very surprising within just 1 year of really being introduced into the legislative process. So that's very exciting. Next slide, please. So really quick, I know Patrice, she kind of went through some of the programs that were authorized in the infrastructure package, but I thought I'd lay them out here really to point out that there are a lot of things that this new Office of Clean Energy Demonstration has to do in its first 5 years. These 10 programs plus whatever else the appropriators want them to do is going to be a lot of work. Some of the activities have already started, like in the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, or ARDP, but others have a long way to go. The Department of Energy hasn't even really started to implement them. For example, like the rural and remote areas projects. These are things that the Department of Energy hasn't really started to do. So next slide, please. So after we realized that this infrastructure package was going to move, and since it had moved so fast, David and I, and really Third Way, which might be listening in on this call, thought it would be really important to bring together outside organizations to really put some more time into thinking about what this new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations could do, especially since it had moved so fast through the legislative process. So the groups here in blue were the original groups that we pulled together to provide recommendations both to the Hill as well as to the Department of Energy. The groups include technical experts in specific technology areas, as well as people that have worked at the Department of Energy at all different levels and both parties to really think about what are the structures, what are the management practices that we would want this new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations to have as a foundation if it is going to be successful into the future. Next slide, please. And so this working group since August has sent a letter to Congress on 8 OCED principles, which I'll go over in just a minute. We've done a lot of analysis and talked to a variety of groups, trying to understand how we could implement those principles. We then rolled up those ideas into an 8-page document, which I believe Jesse has sent out to the Carbon Capture Coalition, talking about how those 8 principles would really be reflected in implementation recommendations. And so how would DOE want to hire? Who would they want to hire? What does that look like in the long run? We've also been engaging with other groups like yours to talk about what are the other additional ideas that we should be thinking about as the Department of Energy really does implement this new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. The other thing I would like to point out with this working group is we're not focused on specific technology areas, at least at this point. What we've been really focused on is the broader innovation cycle and innovation activities and those management structures. So we haven't really gotten into the merits of specific technologies, which I think a lot of individual groups would like to do. Next slide, please. And so here are the 8 principles, high-level principles that the working group came up with. And then sent off to both the Hill as well as the Department of Energy. And I'm not going to go through all of these because I want to leave more time for discussion, but just to highlight a couple of them, some of them do really reflect what David has already talked about, so I'm not going to go into all that in a lot of detail. But the first one is really for this new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations to focus on large-scale demonstration, the last step before commercial. This could be as a large scale, being very expensive, as probably some of your projects are. It could also be focused on that, as we were saying, that last step before commercial, which might not be as much money for smaller projects like a geothermal project, but still require particular expertise that the Department of Energy doesn't necessarily have, focused on, like looking at the market, understanding what the financial structures would be. And that really gets into our second recommendation around private sector management expertise, is really making sure that as we're looking at the scale of a project and the expense of a project, we are thinking about how the market is going to play in developing that technology and how that technology is going to meet that market, I should say. Additionally, we thought that it was very important that the Department of Energy have strong project management expertise, which David's report also talks about. And particularly, we wanted to ensure that the Department of Energy was looking at risk management. This is something that the department has a very difficult time doing, and we encourage them to think about how they structure and frame risk, both internally as well as externally, giving the Department of Energy's employees the ability to create milestones with those projects to ensure that they're moving those projects forward, as well as the ability to terminate those projects if that is required because the project is not meeting specific milestones or activities that were outlined in their project, which was selected through a merit review process. The other area that the group felt strongly about was that there would be strong stakeholder engagement, both with the private sector in sharing information and ensuring that there is a cycle of being able to communicate with the private sector, but also with communities, ensuring that communities have a say in the kinds of demonstrations that might be going into their communities. And then I'm going to continue forward so we can talk a little bit more. Thank you. The other thing that we recommended is, since this is a brand new office, we wanted it to have strong connections to the applied energy programs, especially since that is where there's a lot of technical expertise. So we suggested that there be strong connectivity under the Undersecretary for Science and Energy, which is where the applied programs are. But also that since this is supposed to be closer to the market in thinking about that last step before commercial, that the Loan Program Office Director be the acting director until there is a permanent director for the OCED. Now, that's something that the Department of Energy has not implemented based on our recommendations. So I think that there's all sorts of interesting conversations to have about that. But what we really were trying to say was that OCED should be closer to LPO and how it's thinking about market and engaging with the private sector. Next slide. And finally, based on our recommendations that we made to the Department of Energy and conversations that we've had with the Department of Energy, we realize that there's a little bit more information that might be helpful for outside groups to be thinking about as it relates to the development of this new office. And the first one is on, as I mentioned, risk management. Is what does that look like? What does a framework for risk look like? If there are projects that fail, how can you use those failures to inform the innovation process and to inform the market and the private sector about the state of that technology as well as the market? And how do you perceive risk? Because the federal government is supposed to be taking risk on with these kinds of technologies. So there's a variety of different ways that you can manage risk looking at a portfolio of different projects. We're also thinking about making a recommendation around community outreach and engagement. including ensuring that there are mechanisms for communities and stakeholders to have with the Department of Energy input into those processes, ensuring that through the solicitation process that projects are required to have outreach and engagement plans, as well as even providing some kind of funding to communities where they can have their own technical experts so they can participate with project developers on a demonstration project, ensuring that they have those capabilities and resources. And then a final recommendation that we are thinking about making to the Department of Energy is around industry technology assistance, which is really saying, okay, if you're going to apply for OCED, you need to have really good market data, you need to know your community, and you need to have all of your technical gaps filled. And sometimes between a pilot and that full-scale demonstration, there are still little gaps that still need to be filled. And so we want to provide a little bit of technical assistance to those companies as they apply to the Department of Energy. And I think that that is our last slide. There you go. And I would love to take some questions now.
Thank you so much, David and Jetta. That's really, it's really great presentation and just kind of great high-level overview of how these organizations have been thinking about the structure for this office. And so, again, we'd really like this to be a conversation. I do have some prepared questions for David and Jetta, but and I'll kick things off with a question for them. But please start to think of some questions, and you can again put them in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand, and we will call on you so you can actually speak. And then just kind of as a reminder and disclaimer, David and Jetta are in no way representing the administration or DOE in their answers. This is just their own perspectives at ITIF and also the groups that they're convening. So just to sort of kick things off, and it's interesting, I think there's a lot of, we're certainly seeing in this in the media, there's a lot of parallels being drawn between these demonstration dollars in the infrastructure law and the American Resource Recovery Act. And so I'm curious, sort of what lessons learned are you taking away from ARA in crafting these recommendations for the structure of OCED?
Yeah, so the ARA, in my study of the ARA, we concluded it had sort of a mixed record. There were some projects that went really well and others that didn't. One of the big differentiators was scale. Most of the really big projects didn't get completed. And sometimes that was because they were simply too ambitious. Sometimes there were some management issues. And I think the biggest observation was that there was just inconsistency across the different offices. And so one of the ideas behind a single office is to have a kind of technology neutral expertise. So the applied offices are really great at their specialty areas, but they sometimes get attached to their favorite technologies. And that's common among experts. We tend to be overly optimistic about our ideas and have overconfidence. It's a well-known bias. So it would be helpful to have some less attached parties to make some of the decisions, especially go, no-go type decisions. On the other hand, I would say that the Recovery Act proved that the government can manage some of these projects well. There had been many years before that, going back to the 70s, where there had been very, very few of these projects. So there was a big burst of energy at the end of the second oil crisis around 1980. And after that, the conclusion, especially among Republicans and conservatives, was that this was a waste of money and the federal government really shouldn't fund energy demonstration projects at all. So there was a long gap. Part of the argument was that these projects couldn't be managed well. And I think the Recovery Act proved that it was possible to manage them well, but we could still do better. So that was the biggest conclusion that I drew from it.
And I would only add, and I think it's really important to point this out, is that over the years, especially since ARA, the development of the Loan Programs Office has really helped DOE start to think a little bit more about the market and what it takes to get these technologies to commercial deployment. And so I think that there are lessons learned within the department that they can take from LPO in developing this new office. And I think that that's going to be very important as they are structuring this and thinking about who to pull into the office.
Great, thank you both. That's really interesting. We actually have someone who has a question they'd like to state. So I'm going to call on you, Jim Wilcox. Grace will unmute you.
Thank you. Good morning. Jim Wilcox in Commerce County, Wyoming, a commissioner here. As we look at these projects, many of them require the engagement of utility companies. As we talk about carbon, is there and they stand alone on their own, and then you've got private investors that may be working at carbon capture or other of those technologies. Is this program set up to engage the utility companies as partners, or is that up to the proponent of the project? And sometimes it will be the utility companies, but I know in many cases it's really a third party, particularly that's reaching out to a coal-fired power plant, trying to do carbon capture, reduce. Do you envision this program reaching out to utilities, or is that really going to be up to the proponent? Thank you.
I can take that. So I do think it's going to be up to the applicant, but what we are hoping the Department of Energy does is encourage, through the criteria that it includes in its solicitation, that the applicant think about its market, think about who the offtake will be, who the offtake customer will be, think about how it's going to ensure that it has longevity into the future. So including the utilities in their thinking is going to be very important. Additionally, to ensure that a solicitation is set up properly, we would encourage the Department of Energy to engage utilities across the board on what does that look like? What should that criteria look like if the Department of Energy wants an applicant to engage with their utilities in these different projects? So we hope that DOE thinks about strategic engagement with utilities as well as other outside stakeholders from beginning to end. What does it look like when you're putting together a solicitation? What should be included in the criteria? How are those partners going to be a part of that project, potentially even through cost share of some sort, all the way through a project development process? David, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, so very broadly, the projects tend to be public-private partnerships, but the lead partner can vary. So if you look at the Recovery Act projects, some were led by utilities. I think more typically these tend to be led by vendors, and then the utilities are partners. They're the operating partners, especially if you're talking about carbon capture at an industrial or power generation facility. But there are a lot of different structures. Again, as Jetta said, it really depends on how the funding announcement is set up, and then how the partnership structures itself. I do think one thing to look for is, as O said, hires its staff. Do they have folks who have experience in the relevant industries? I think that's very important. We've understood that as they search for a director, they're looking for folks who have some industry experience, whether that's the utility sector or some other sector, I don't know for sure. But it's important to look for that the person isn't, coming out of a more typical political appointee background for the DOE, which is obviously very valuable for getting stuff done in DC. But this person needs to be able to relate to the project development sector and the finance sector.
Great, thank you both. We got some great questions coming in, and I'm actually going to jump to one that I had in my mind as well, which is around community engagement. And so, my question was kind of two-part question here. My question was, the administration has a big focus on environmental justice. They have their Justice 40 initiative, and kind of thinking around how do you think DOE will incorporate this focus into these programs? And then the question we received is, in many cases, these facilities have already received their zoning and permits. And so in those cases, how do you think, what would community engagement look like from this office's perspective?
So again, I think that this would be at multiple levels. I would encourage the Department of Energy to be starting from the very beginning, and when they're developing their solicitations. In our recommendations that we made to the Department of Energy, we recommended that they create some kind of VACA or use an existing VACA to bring in stakeholder input, including with communities. So they are thinking about that from the very beginning. I think that additionally, we would want to see, this is, I think, the recommendation that we're going to make very soon, applicants include some kind of stakeholder engagement strategy and plan in their application as part of their selection criteria. So the Department of Energy will be reviewing that. And if anyone has applied to DOE recently, you'll see that they already have criteria in several of their applications, several of their solicitations around the Justice 40 initiative. So I think they're already moving in that direction, which is excellent because it's very much in line with obviously the administration as well as what we've been recommending in our letter. I think, was there another part of that on the community piece there, Jesse?
Yeah, and this is something I think too that I've heard a little bit of feedback from some of the companies and project developers in the coalition, which is just they're trying to wrap their arms around this question, which is at a project scale, you know, the zoning and the permit doesn't require community engagement. And so I guess it's good to, you know, thinking through like what are they going to be required to do from DOE's perspective as far as these programs. So it sounds like you've already answered that, but David, if you have other thoughts too, they'd be welcome.
No, I do think it will vary a lot from project to project. And there are already, as Jetta mentioned, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program was basically transferred into the new office from the NE office, the Nuclear Energy Office. So that project is already, you know, started. So I think I think projects will probably come into the pipeline at different levels of maturity. But so, you know, it may depend a bit on what the permitting and zoning processes look like in particular jurisdictions, whether they do involve some form of outreach, you know, are there public hearings? There may be some criteria specifically associated with getting the federal funding for the project, but it is still very much TBD. I mean, we're just making recommendations. I think the department is in the process of thinking these things through, and the leadership hasn't been hired yet, so somewhat unknown. But I think from our point of view, we think there should be some, you know, minimal, I should say, threshold level of community engagement across all the projects. But it wouldn't necessarily be the same in every project, and, you know, different kinds of projects propose different kinds of risks and opportunities for communities. So there's going to be a lot of variation from project to project and across the different technology areas.
You know, and another thing I was just thinking about is, you know, one of the reasons why we think it's important for there to be potentially these smaller community grants around demonstration is, like all technology development, sometimes it happens on the two coasts, and we want to ensure that there are communities across the country that have the opportunity to participate in this, you know, opportunity to demonstrate new technologies. And communities don't often have these kinds of resources. They might have slow permitting because they just don't have the resources to move things fast. They might not understand the technologies. They might not understand the impacts of those technologies. And so we think it's important that communities across the country have additional assistance through some funding so they can potentially participate in this process. So I think that's another really important thing, is that we want geographic, just, you know, communities across the country to participate.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a question now. A couple of these things you've already touched on, but I would like to dig a little deeper on, you know, you both mentioned risk and managing risk. You know, for a lot of these technologies that we're talking about and that our groups are talking about, they've been technologically demonstrated, but not deployed at commercial scale. And so when you think about risk, I'm just curious if you could go a little further on your recommendations around that and how the office should manage risk.
Sure. So I think there are a lot of different ways to think about that. At the very highest level, there is sort of a portfolio risk. So, you know, stepping back to think about the range of technologies that are needed to bring us towards net zero, if it's nuclear plus carbon capture plus energy storage plus hydrogen, Some of those could sort of fail at a very high level. You know, there's been opposition to nuclear power now for 30 odd years. There have been very few plants built. So at one level, we're talking about managing risk at that really grand scale. But within the projects, obviously there's lots of different kinds of risk. As you mentioned, Jesse, many of these technologies are relatively mature. Whether they can be operated, you know, effectively at commercial scale, especially when we're thinking about retrofits, the integration of systems within a complex like an industrial complex, that poses a set of risks. And then probably the most challenging risk is the risk of, you know, what the market's going to look like 5 years or 10 years down the road, right? So these projects take a long time to build, things change. This was really the critique of the demonstration projects in the late 1970s and early 1980s. By the time these projects were built, the price of oil was down to 25% of its earlier level. And that's, you know, that's really a challenge. I don't know that there's any way to fully mitigate that risk, but we would like, as the project funding goes through, to think it through. You know, the developer should have a plan to, you know, what kind of market conditions would allow their technology to thrive. So there's no way to avoid risk, right? One of the purposes of doing demonstration projects and doing innovation generally is to, you know, take the risk, and some succeed and some fail, which is the reason why the government has an interest in this. But I think that market risk is the biggest one. And of course, in the world of climate policy, you know, market and policy are totally interactive. So if there's an assumption that, you know, we need $100 per ton price on carbon for this thing to succeed, you know, that would have a different weight in the project selection process than if it requires a $50 per ton price. So I think that's you know, one of the selection factors that DOE may think about, and we hope they would think about the downstream opportunities and risks.
And I think one of the additional strategies that Congress actually has put forward was authorized in the Energy Act of 2020 is a milestone-based approach to these very large projects. This is something that we've learned can work really well for the development of, you know, projects with a large amount of money from NASA and the Department of Defense, where it's very clear and transparent from both the federal government side as well as the project developer side of what those milestones are meant to be and how you achieve them. And that's also laid out in the criteria for the application. So really being transparent about that provides both, you know, clarity to the project developer, but also to the project developer's investors, as well as to the political people that care about seeing that project developed. So I think it's very critical that everyone understand, okay, if this project doesn't meet this milestone, then there's a reason why it might need to be shut down. And that is really critical for everyone to be transparent about those particular milestones. So I think that's something that Congress put in the law, and we're hoping that the Department of Energy implements.
Great, thank you. I wanted to build off that kind of conversation around risk and go back to markets and knowing, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't know what the market is going to look like in the future, but David, I think you had said we're not great at commercializing technology in this country. And so can you talk a little bit more about some of the recommendations you're thinking around how DOE can better understand the potential marketplace for these technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we go into a lot of depth. I think it's really mostly a matter of personnel and relationships. So you need to hire people who have, you know, an understanding of how the private sector thinks, project developers, investors, and then there needs to be a dialogue between, you know, between the program and the development community. So hopefully you guys will be having webinars with folks that are running these programs once they're on board. So I think it's a lot about developing that community and those relationships, and you know, having I also think the office and the department as a whole needs the analytical capability of understanding these markets. So obviously leadership is important, but so is dependent expertise which I think DOE does have a good track record with the Energy Information Administration, FERC, and other capabilities. So that analytical resource is there and can be strengthened.
I don't know, Jetta, if you wanted anything or you're to add to that, or you're good.
No, I think that that's right. I think DOE does have a lot of those capabilities, but it's really trying to focus them on what are those needs of the private sector. And you know, and I'll just add that as David has mentioned many times, DOE needs to bring that expertise in. And what was great about what Congress did was that it provided DOE special hiring authority to move quicker on some of these particular positions. So if your audience, I know you probably love your own projects that you've been working on, but if you'd like to raise your hand and serve in the federal government, the Department of Energy has a special hiring portal, and they can move fast on applications. So if you think you want to influence that process as a private sector company that knows how to do project development, as individuals, you should apply to the Department of Energy.
Great, thanks, Jetta. Yeah, that's it's a tall order for sure that they have ahead of them. Keep the questions coming. I have more here too, but kind of wrapping down, looking at our last final questions here. So the infrastructure law, provides funding for 5 years, and David, you said that's a long way away, but I think, also thinking about permanence and durability, are you already starting to think about what does this program look like in the future? What does a successful program look like 5 years from now? And then sort of building on that, do you think there are other things that will require annual appropriations, even in the near term, beyond what's provided in the infrastructure law?
Well, so I can jump in and just say that the working group is thinking about what does the future look like for the new office. What does an appropriation strategy look like for different technologies? Right now they are very constrained to the technologies that were authorized in the Energy Act from 2020 and then appropriated in the infrastructure package that passed last year. So I think the group is looking at what are the other technologies that need to be funded and how do we ensure that there is a ramp for the new Office of Clean Energy demonstration. So that is something that everyone is looking at, because there will be new technologies, and $21 billion is a very large amount, but the opportunity is enormous and the challenges as well. And as we try to get to net zero, we will need all these different technologies. David, do you want to add?
Yeah, so I do think we need to worry about the possibility that we'll go off a cliff in 5 years. So this was a, people call it a once in a generation opportunity, but we want this office to be around for good. So as Jetta mentioned, I think in the next 5 years, we should try to ramp up the regular appropriations. And it's a long ways. I mean, going from 0 to 4 or 5 billion in 5 years is still a pretty steep curve. So we do want to try to get ahead of that. And so when the infrastructure law expires, that we don't, the office just doesn't expire with it, and that we have a portfolio for the long term that includes the portfolios that are listed in the infrastructure bill, but also go beyond that. And as new things become commercially viable or potentially viable, that the office can have the flexibility to jump in and invest there.
Great. We got a more technical question, and I don't know if you have all been thinking about it, but I'll ask just in case, which is what cost shares between federal and non-federal players make sense, and does it vary by sector?
Yeah, I did speak to this a little bit in the report, and the answer is a lot makes sense, and it varies by sector. So one of the things that jumps out as you look at the history of demonstration projects is, Congress says 50-50 and all the projects come in at 50-50, which is quite a surprise if you're thinking about a range of risks. So we would expect that actually projects would be right along the whole risk spectrum from, sort of fully commercial to fully public, but somewhere in the middle, but not, all stuck at 50% or in some cases 80% under other programs. That's just a tricky business. And, exactly how you negotiate the cost share is a challenge, I think, for the administrators of the program. It can really be a big sink of time. But the energy, the kind of, I think it's the basic operating statute of the DOE does allow the Secretary of Energy to delegate negotiation to the program. So it would be possible for the program to have the authority to basically negotiate on a cost share on a project by project basis. And I think in an ideal world, that's probably what I would prefer. Whether you have the person power to do all that work, I don't know. But generally, I would say I would like this office to have more flexibility in negotiating cost share so that the cost shares reflect the real risks from the sort of public and private perspectives. And I think that can really only be discovered through some kind of a negotiation. In practice, probably a lot of them will wind up being 50-50 because that's what more or less what Congress mandated. So we'll see, but there is, at least in principle, some flexibility that the Secretary of Energy can allocate to the program.
Great, thank you. A question sort of more on strategy, which is, what would you recommend as a helpful role for, this question is specific to environmental NGOs, but I'll make it broader, environmental NGOs and other stakeholders to ensure the success of this office and this demonstration dollars?
So, well, first of all, the success, we all should feel responsible for success of this office. And so you will see over the next several months, the Department of Energy putting out requests for information to inform how they put these new solicitations together. So I would encourage groups to respond to those and tell them what you would like to see Department of Energy do around community engagement, environmental justice, and private sector cost share. Those are all your opportunity to engage in the process. So I think that is, one of the things that the environmental community can do. I also think it's important that we recognize that communities across the country are going to have different needs and different technology expertise. And so I think that we want the Department of Energy to think and rely on what's going on in those communities and leverage that and ensure that they are giving them the resources to be involved in these conversations. Because I think that that's also really important to ensuring that the environmental communities, environmental justice is dealt with in those communities as appropriate. I think that's really important too.
Yeah, I would add to that. I would urge communities to try to think about rules and criteria and principles that are technology neutral. So one of the real challenges we have, I think, in the climate and energy innovation world is that people get attached to particular technologies, or they have technologies that they oppose under all circumstances. And with the creation of this new office, there's a chance to think through, principles that are, in a sense, blind to the technology, and then we can see how they apply in each case to the specifics. Big projects, small projects, projects with local environmental risks, projects with less of those, but where the risks might be in the transportation of materials or something like that. So, I kind of at ITIF, one of our principal objectives is to advance, innovation across a broad front, and we have seen in the history of DOE a little bit of a circular firing squad situation. So one of the things that we're trying to do with our working group is dialogue across some of those differences. And it's been exciting to see the partners in this effort come together. Not that everybody endorses every single line. We want to be clear that this is a group thinking project, but not necessarily something that bears the official stamp of every group that's involved. But that dialogue is really important, and to be willing to, imagine things at a slightly more conceptual level and not say, I hate nuclear, I hate solar, whatever the case may be.
Great, thank you both. Well, we're almost out of time. I'm going to hand things back over to my colleague Patrice Lum just to provide a few closing remarks. And thank you so much, David and Jetta, for your excellent presentation today and food for thought. I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but it's really exciting work to be doing as a group and a collection of organizations. So thank you so much, Patrice.
Thank you for having us. And we think this community is really important to the future of the climate, and so we wish you all success as well.
Thank you.
And let me echo Jesse's thanks to both of you, David and Jetta. I, for one, on a Monday morning, this was enlightening and helpful and thought-provoking. We, certainly look forward to engaging with you in your working group as you continue to think about how this new office rolls out. And for those of you that have taken in the webinar today, that means that you are in some way engaged with us via the Carbon Capture Coalition or the Industrial Innovation Initiative or through the Regional Carbon Capture Deployment Initiative, and that's great. We are ramping up implementation work across all of our projects. And so I would encourage you to reach out to your contacts at those 3 projects, those project leads, to learn more about how you can become involved in our work. And as we all continue to catch the car alongside David, not just with this office, but in so many ways. We will provide a recording of this webinar back out to the participants of the projects I just mentioned. And we'll visit with David and Jetta after this as well to see if they will also make the slides that they presented today available to our project participants. So with that, we will conclude, and I wish everyone a wonderful day. Thanks all.